The four of them, my paternal grandparents, Ombanoi, Kobai, and Junam, had been left behind in Saigon in 1975. My grandfather, Omnoi, planned their escape, and in 1978, he put their plan into motion. They acquired falsified documents which said that they were Chinese nationals. My uncle, Junam, had secretly installed a tractor engine onto a local river barge, and under the cover of night, they stole the barge and chugged away from Saigon across the Gulf of Thailand. My teenage aunt was disguised as a boy to avoid being raped in the event that they were boarded by pirates. Several days later, they arrived in Malaysia and bribed local officials there with 10 gold bullions. And in Malaysia, they languished at a refugee camp for 6 months while they tried to contact my father. They finally arrived in America in January 1979. Photographers met them at the Harrisburg airport. A grainy black and white photo appeared in the local Carlisle paper, along with a story about their harrowing months-long odyssey. The front page article read, "Boat people find refuge in Carlisle." The arrival of more trans was headline news for our drowsy town. So I'd like to play a book trailer for my book Saigon. I don't think that authors normally make book trailers, but when my book tour was canceled about 3 weeks before it started, some friends and I here in Portland decided to, sort of do something about it. And so a filmmaker friend of mine volunteered. Well, he didn't volunteer. I may have roped him into making a book trailer. So we put the whole thing together in a short amount of time, but I think I love how it came out. And so I hope it captures the essence of what the book is about.
Hey, I'm Phuc. I'm a Latin teacher and a tattooer. This is my shop, and this is my book. It's a book about, well, what the hell is it about? You know what? Let's rewind. Is the book about my family and the sacrifices they made to escape Vietnam? Or is it about growing up in small-town America? Is it about immigration or assimilation? Rebellion or loyalty? Murder or love? I guess it's actually about Star Wars. Or maybe it's about punk rock. Or maybe it's about the books I love that made me who I am. My book is about all those things, but it's about being more than those things. I'm more than just a sum of my parts and experiences. Let's not forget the words of Walt Whitman. I contradict myself. I contain multitudes.
Thank you so much, Phuc. As you said, you, in addition to being the star of our show, you are also the opening band. And I loved your opening. So now on to the main event. I'm Margaret Talcott. I'm a director at American Ancestors, the New England Historic Genealogical Society. I'm also curator of the American Inspiration Author Series, which is our in-person event series produced right in our historic rotunda on Newbury Street. It is really great to be in the virtual world and to have as our partners the Boston Public Library and this new virtual series. So Kristin, it is a pleasure. And Kristin and I are delighted to welcome you tonight.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a delight to be here.
And I know you've got some readings that you want to do before we launch into Q&A. So do you want to start with those?
Sure. And I also have an accompanying slideshow of just collages, just so you don't have to look at my forehead while I'm reading for the next 10 minutes. Nestled in the Susquehanna Valley town of Carlisle, Pennsylvania, Carlisle Senior High School sprawled as a monolithic mid-century modern block of types, archetypes, and stereotypes. Industrial gray lockers ringed its hallways, the compartments narrow enough to repel most of your textbooks, but wide enough to collect the trash and detritus from your backpack. Your own personal landfill. Linoleum floors, classrooms with chables, the combo chair tables of the 70s, blackboards, American flags, loudspeakers from which the wah 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 of adult speak would drone. Our school district was so large that the juniors and seniors had their own separate high school, the so-called senior high school, and the freshmen and sophomores had their own underclassmen high school building. Carlisle High School stocked its seats and bleachers with a familiar cast from the 80s, the athletes who towered above the rest of us, the cheerleaders who lay supine beneath them, the geeks with their physics books under their arms, the preps with their tree-torns, swatches, and impeccable Benetton sweaters, a handful of black kids with MC Hammer pants and tall, square afros tightly faded, punks and skaters with their leather jackets and black Converse, a few swirly hippies, the rednecks with their oily palms and cigarettes and trucks. Carlisle High School was another cultural cul-de-sac built with the craftsman blueprint of John Hughes, the Frank Lloyd Wright of teen malaise. Overwhelmingly white, Carlisle's population offered all the rainbows of Caucasia. The town's main employers were Dickinson College, the Army War College, a smoky stack of factories, and the service industries that had sprung up to support the aforementioned trifecta. In the spirit of public education, we progeny were all in the mix together, the itinerant army brats, the ivory sons and daughters of professors, doctors, and lawyers, the greasy offspring of waiters, cooks, and factory workers, and the token refugee family. The Tran family blended right into the mix like proverbial flies in the ointment. That is to say, we didn't. Carlisle's glitter was unmistakably 80s, but its structure was straight from the post-war era, bricked together by the mortar of the 50s. We had a downtown Woolworths with a chrome luncheonette counter and red vinyl stools, and a grand movie theater with its incandescent marquee. The four corners of Carlisle's town square were righted by two courthouses and two churches, Episcopalian and Presbyterian. God and law and God. It wasn't a subtle message to any of us living in Carlisle what was at the heart of the town. And the pièce de résistance, our high school, was the town's designated Cold War fallout shelter. The blue and yellow radiation placards festooned our hallways, reminding us that we were only a button push away from nuclear annihilation. From what I gleaned on television, Carlisle seemed like a slice of American pie a la mode. We bottled lightning bugs on summer nights. Trucks flew Confederate flags. We loitered at 7-Elevens and truck stops. We shopped at flea markets and shot pellet guns. My high school provided a daycare for girls who had gotten pregnant but were still attending classes. We stirred up marching band pride and fomented football rivalries. The auto shop kids rattled by in muscle cars and smoked in ashen cobbles before the first period bell. We were rural royalty, Dairy Queens and Burger Kings. Then I'm just going to read one more passage about my family's escape from Vietnam. April 1975, Saigon. I remember none of this, but I know all of it. I know all of it because it is the family story. I was not yet 2 when my maternal grandparents, Ombawai, made the decision that we were all leaving Vietnam. My grandparents both worked for the US Embassy, and our family had been monitoring the thundering advance of the Viet Cong army as closely as they were fretting the quiet unraveling of the Republic of Vietnam. The call to evacuate came at the end of April, and my mother's parents made the arrangements for 10 people, themselves, my mother and father, her sisters and brothers. I was their only grandchild, as my mother was the eldest. My father chose to accompany my mother and me, leaving behind his parents and his 2 youngest siblings who, without the proper paperwork, were unable to board the American transports. We waited for the bus that would take us to the airfield amid a swelling throng of frantic South Vietnamese. Bus after bus filled as desperate families pushed on, bulging them beyond capacity. We moved up the line, finally at the front, and we were ready to board. Our bus pulled up, the doors opened. Half of my family members were already on board when, according to everyone's account, I began to shriek so loudly and inconsolably that our family agreed to deboard the bus. My grandmother comforted us as we stood in line again. "Let's wait. It's okay. We'll take the next one." As we watched that bus pull away, it was struck by mortar fire and exploded, killing everyone on board. We lay on the ground, cowering. Some bystanders scrambled to the wreckage to help, but it was war, and a losing war at that. With the burning carcass of our bus still in view, we boarded the next bus, not knowing if it too would explode and kill us all. But it did not explode. As we passed a checkpoint, the South Vietnamese military police separated the evacuees into two groups, able-bodied men into one area and women and children into the other. They were conscripting men of fighting age for fodder in their last stand against the North Vietnamese army in Saigon, and all the young men in our cohort were detained. Heartbreak and terror. My father, along with my uncles, was held behind. He watched as my mother and I boarded a helicopter. One of my shoes came off with the push and pull of evacuation. We lifted off, leaving behind my shoe and my father. To where? How could we possibly find one another? The only plan was to escape from Saigon, and in the din and chaos of the evacuation, our family was broken apart. My mother and I landed on an aircraft carrier, took another helicopter, and landed at another base. That was the beginning and the end. South Vietnam collapsed. The army was in retreat. Government officials were fleeing. Even in that ending for us, in the great collapse of Saigon, it was not the end that so many others suffered. It was not crashed planes, abandoned babies, or mass executions. And that end was our beginning. In that death lay the seeds of a new life. We weren't bodies in a shallow grave. We weren't the nude children in the war photos with our clothes burned off. We were fortunate, even in the midst of such misfortune. We landed in Guam, and from there we were relocated to Wake Island. My mother was distraught. Had my father been killed? Did he manage to escape with my grandmother's connections to the embassy? How would he know where to find us? Thousands of evacuees, wrenched from loved ones, scratched out desperate notes and posted them on walls all across the airfields of Guam and Wake Island. If you see this note, please find us at. We're alive and at the camp at. Luck of all luck. My father and uncles were reunited with us weeks later on Wake Island. He had escaped Saigon, and somehow, 4,000 miles away and 2 weeks later, he arrived on the same island in a refugee camp full of strangers uprooted by war. The splinters of our family were reassembled. We needed to stay together, all 12 of us, and we said this as we filled out our paperwork, talking to the camp staff, hoping to be sponsored. Only Ombawai knew English from their work at the embassy, but the army officers spoke too fast and about things they didn't know, using vocabulary they hadn't learned. Refugee, relocation, asylum.
Thank you for that, Phuc. That was very powerful. I'm Kristin Motte. I'm the Adult Programs Librarian at the Boston Public Library, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. Phuc was supposed to be with us at the Boston Public Library tonight, and here we are in this virtual space in this interesting time. I'd like to just introduce Phuc to everyone. Phuc Tran has been a Latin teacher and a tattoo artist since 1997. He graduated with a bachelor's degree in classics from Bard College and a master's degree from UMass Amherst. A lover of language and of music, Phuc gave a TED Talk in 2012. Grammar, Identity, and the Dark Side of the Subjunctive was his TED Talk. He also actually created a music playlist to go along with this book. You can check that out on Spotify.
So Phuc, what an illustrious bio. I just love all the places that you've been. You're, from Carlisle, Pennsylvania to Annandale-on-Hudson, Bard College, down to New York City, up to Portland. And I mean, you are most certainly the hero of your own story. But I must say, if there are other heroes in it, besides yourself, it is really the teachers in your life who express such an interest in you from an early age. They hear you, they care about you, they save you from all sorts of trouble, and then they get you to be the intellectual person that you are. And I just, was so interested into your relationship with your own life as a teacher. You are a teacher now yourself, which many people noticed in the question and answer. And tell us about teaching and what that does for you, given your experience with teachers in your life.
Yeah, I think you're, thanks for bringing that up, Margaret. My teachers absolutely were the heroes of my young life. Yeah, maybe in tandem with my brother also. he certainly suffered heroically living in the house with me. But I love teaching, and I think I love it primarily because it's an opportunity for me to share my passion for languages and for reading great books and thinking deep thoughts, in 50 minutes. They have this 50-minute block with me. They come in and, we kind of hit the road. And, I think if I can be my most authentic self and, really express who I am and my passions for things that I love, I mean, I don't know what else I could do to, get kids excited about that sort of thing. And I think the authenticity piece is really critical. I think young people, especially teenagers, can smell, sort of phonies from a mile away, to sort of borrow J.D. Salinger's parlance. So I think if you're fake, you are really telling kids that you don't take them seriously. And I take adolescents incredibly seriously because I think my teachers took me so seriously as well. Probably the first people in my life.
The maybe a slightly less serious follow-up question. One of our viewers wants to know if you do any online teaching of Latin.
I have not, but I mean, given the state of the world, never say never. But no, I've never taught online.
Well, maybe an opportunity for you.
For sure.
So what is the intersection, or is there an intersection for you, Phuc, between music and your passion for music and your creativity as a tattoo artist? Do they meet somewhere?
Yeah, I am not, well, let me say I've never thought about it, just because I think my love of music goes back so far and so early. And I think part of it is just sort of loving pop culture, and early on also recognizing that like being knowledgeable about pop culture had some social cachet. I mean, all that withstanding, I mean, I just love popular music still to this day. But I think, I wonder about what's behind that question, because I think sometimes, when we try to kind of reconcile competing or paradoxical interests that people have or pursuits, I think our desire to make those things fit ends up feeling a little bit too much like we're trying to, right angles that don't need to be righted. So I think they're related, but I'm not, or maybe they're not. And I know this might sound unsatisfying, but I think, they're kind of like, they come together at right angles and they're not coplanar, right? They're not on the same flat surface. And I think that actually is exciting to me, that there are different, facets, literal, sort of, angled facets to who I am. My love of, classical literature, my tattooing, my, love of motorcycles. I mean, those are all things that kind of inhabit who I am, and they're, maybe they make sense and are congruous, and, maybe they're not.
And that's okay, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think in this day and age, I think we're trying to boil people down into sound bites and 140 characters, like it's constantly, especially the online world. Like, I think there's less of a, there's less capacity for us to be messy. And I think that was really a driving motivator for me in writing the book, was I really wanted to sort of lay out my young life in a messy way, and also have it be authentic and honest.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, sure.
So I loved the opening of each of your chapters was named, is I think all of them are named after great works of literature, as I recall. And I was so impressed that these classic works of literature, their messages really inhabit your life. Particularly as a teen, you said you had so many scarlet letters of alienation. Nathaniel Hawthorne, that you were at once toggling between being Achilles and being Agamemnon, and that Homer was really reverberating in your head. And I just was, curious. It sounds like that sort of came on in a good way in high school, early high school. And I was curious as to whether the classics are still reverberating in your head at this point in your life. You talk often of Jean-Paul Sartre and also Albert Camus. And of course, Camus wrote The Plague. And so I was wondering if you have any of the classics, particularly The Plague, echoing right now in your head.
That's I love that question, Margaret. I think, and I don't, I'm going to say this, and I don't mean to be glib, but I think I leaned so deeply into literature because it was one of the few places that I could find solace, and I think literature started that importance that literature had for me started to wane when I started going to counseling and therapy, to be totally honest. And I guess that's not glib. It's like a huge, I want to champion mental health for everybody. Like as a young person, when you don't, especially in the 70s and 80s, when I think counseling and therapy were just not as widely talked about and mental health wasn't talked about, I think as a young person, I just thought I was just clinging to literature as a life raft, because otherwise I just felt like I was going to get swept away and, lost. And so that was true for me. I read and thought, sort of, and leaned into literature really deeply until, my late 20s, early 30s. When I was like, oh, therapy, this feels really good. I'm gonna try this thing out, And so then I think that kind of deadened the impact, for better or worse, on literature. But I still love reading. But I think when I was a teenager, I needed, and loved reading in a very different way.
Are you reading anybody modern now? Do you find the same reverberation with modern literature? Is there anything sitting on your bedside table that echoes for you in that way, or poetry? Or are you just so busy teaching and tattooing?
Within the last decade, the book that I've read that has been life-changing in the way that the Lens books have been, I read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, and I hadn't read that before. And then in maybe like 8 years ago, someone couldn't believe that I hadn't read it. There's just so many books and so little time. So she lent it to me, and I read, Man's Search for Meaning is just amazing. And I've read that probably 3 times since I read it 8 years ago. I highly recommend it. Highly, highly recommend it. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a good tip. Nothing. We all need a search for meaning right now.
Yeah. So. Have you read it, Margaret? I'm curious.
I have to confess that I have not, and it's on my list.
Yeah,
now I'm going to read it.
Yeah, it wasn't even on my radar, so I was like, "What's this?" I'm always excited when people are like, "You have to." Well, when the injunction is, "You have to read this book; it'll change your life." I'm always game to read something like that.
Yeah, no, I remember reading Darkness at Noon as a teen and somehow feeling that changed me. Some of these really, really bottom dark novels and books are really nonfiction. So thank you. I will turn to that in these dark days.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you.
So Phuc, we have a question from an audience member about how did you learn memoir writing? How did you get into this process and teach yourself the technique, and what was the process for getting the book pulled together?
Sure. I'll try and target it specifically just to the memoir, like the technique of memoir writing. And I think, part of it, I think, just came from my process of getting talking to my agent. And, I was approached by a literary agent who asked me if I was interested in writing memoir because she had seen the TED Talk, and I was super busy, and I just thought, I'll write the thing that is going to be so sort of me, I think my goal in writing was to take all these Venn diagrams that I felt were were inside me, right? Like the love of literature and the, you know, sort of like the punk rock piece and, you know, sort of my irreverent humor. And I just sort of took them all and smushed them down into, you know, sort of like an 8-page essay. And I thought, well, if she likes this, like, this is who I am, sort of unabashedly and without any apologies. And, you know, so that sort of, I'm going to fast forward quite a bit, you know, so in the process of writing, I think the most important thing for me was that I write in an authentic and genuine way. And so, you know, I returned to E.B. White's injunction, you know, in Elements of Style. He says that when you're writing, you need to write for an audience of one, meaning that that I couldn't have too many constituencies in my head, because I felt like that would just sort of detract from the message and sort of present all this anxiety about, oh, like, oh, is my wife gonna like this? Is my agent gonna like this? Is my editor gonna like this? You know, at the end of the day, of any writing day, I wanted to write things that would make me laugh or make me cry or, you know, make me wince or cringe. So I really just was focused on writing the thing that would sort of make me sort of pleased. And, you know.
So you were really aiming for authenticity. You really wanted to connect with your own inner voice when you were writing. So when you wrote it down on the page, you felt connected with it, that this, yes, represents me and my experience.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that at any point, the benchmark for me as to whether the book or the writing was successful is if only I could have written it. You know, and I think the tricky thing is that some people are also, you know, can do that, and it just isn't something that, you know, for better or worse, publishing companies are looking for, you know. So I think I feel very fortunate, let me just say, like, so lucky that, you know, that there's this sort of convergence of, you know, my being ready to tell the story, you know, my writing it in a way that publishers would have that they enjoyed and thought readers would like, and then sort of having that opportunity to tell that story. But yeah, so I think luck is a huge part of it also. So for whatever that's worth.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Of course, you had some amazing fodder to work with, which also not to be left behind is the Reagan era. And being in rural suburban America, you know, in the 1980s was a remarkable place to be. You called it in your novel the birth of consumerism. The summit of brand obsession was going on in the 1980s. And I'll just read ever so briefly. You said, "Our neighbors with their polished cars, grand homes, backyard swing sets, they symbolized for us our glittering goals." And so that there was some goal in being a consumer at that point. And what, in such amazing comparison to the experience of you coming over, that goal, did it shift when you got to Bard? Has it shifted now? You know, what's your experience of goals from that point on?
Gosh, you know, I think it's definitely not consumer based. I hope. And, you know, at this point, you know, I think so many of my goals are dictated by my responsibilities. You know, I have 2 young daughters, so I think, and I'm married, so I think my primary goals are to be a good spouse and to be a good father, you know, first and foremost, and then maybe in there somewhere, you know, be the best tattooer that I can be, you know, be a you know, reasonably good teacher consistently, and you know, be a good person. Yeah. Pretty...
You mentioned that back in high school, that the goal of dressing punk and finding the right clothes and sort of fitting into that category of was something that really was important to you as a source of identity. So it's did you continue on with that goal through high school, through college, through?
Yeah, do you mean like the concern about
or there's some consumerism around being punk, for
yeah,
sure.
Yeah,
I mean,
no,
there's a certain look, it requires trust, right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I'm not worried about fitting in or having the right shirt or, you know, having the right, you know, boots or whatever. You know, obviously, like I like to look nice, and
Yeah.
I like
Yeah.
to have
Yeah.
nice shoes. But it's not like, oh, it's not like status markers where it's like, oh,
Yeah.
I need to go buy a pair of Uggs now because I want to look cool and impress people. I think if anything, like the biggest breakthrough that I had at the end of high school and even into college was how it didn't matter to me anymore what people thought of me, right? Like that, the self-acceptance is a hard fought, it's a hard fought goal. And I think once I achieved it, I thought, oh, okay, like it felt really like everything else was kind of secondary.
Yeah. Of course.
Yeah, and I would say it really like into my 20s again, just to give a shout out to therapy again, right?
Well,
It's like,
this
yeah.
is why I call it the terror of high school and the terror of middle school.
Yeah.
It knows no immigrant pool specifically and terrorizes equally all of us.
Sure.
And then, one quick last punk question before we toss
Sure.
elsewhere. Favorite punk bands?
Oh, the
Did you
Clash.
get in that question from
Yeah,
the
no, I
audience?
haven't gotten that question yet. The Clash.
Uh-huh.
I would say I love Agent Orange as well. They're a Southern California punk band, but I think the Clash first and foremost, for so many. I think mostly because they were willing to sort of blow up the rule book for what punk was about. That they started out as a punk band, and then by their third album, they were already moving away from punk, and then everybody was saying that they weren't punk anymore, and they were sort of already coming up against the limits of what does it mean to be punk, right? If being punk just means being true to yourself. So I love them so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We received a question about the importance of your parents knowing that you understand your family's story of your immigration from Vietnam. So if you could speak to that, was it a matter of importance for them that you know that?
It was, but I think it's, I think for my parents, they didn't talk about it a lot. And in fact, I didn't really get a lot of the details of how we escaped Vietnam, the sequence in which it happened until I started writing, and I just needed to fill in details for the book. And I remember texting with my dad about it, and he asked why. I remember saying that, I was working on this book when the Ken Burns documentary came out, and I was watching that also as it was airing, and I asked him, I was like, oh, like, are you watching this? And he was like, absolutely not. So my parents have never watched or partaken in any of the documentaries or historical or sort of fictional films that have come out about Vietnam and the Vietnam War. And I asked him why, because I thought the Ken Burns documentary was pretty good. And my dad just said it was too painful for him to relive. So in a lot of ways, like, I think my parents haven't, I think the pain of leaving Vietnam in the fall of Saigon and all of the trauma of war, I think is not something that they have, dealt with or come to terms with in any kind of a way that allows them to talk about it. Even in writing the book, that was the first time that I didn't know my parents got separated, that we finally met up on Guam. I mean, it was like, so I think there's more there, but I think they're so reluctant to talk about it. Because there's no, I think as far as they can see, there's nothing about it that they feel good about. I mean, other than surviving, and that bar feels really low to them. And, also it's just wrapped around all the people who didn't survive and, making the heart-wrenching decision to leave my dad's side of the family entirely behind while my mother's side left. I mean, I just don't even know what kind of decisions go into that, right? Yeah.
So they've started anew here, and it's still a process to unpack all of that.
For sure. Yeah.
Continuing on that topic, I have to, the topic of racism, which you hit head on in your book. I was so interested to hear your parents' perception of it as you perceived it in your own, and I'll just read ever so briefly. I mean, it sounds as though they turned the other cheek. In their minds, our occasional mistreatment rippled outward from a national animus toward the Vietnam War. the painful spasm of our country's collective memory. These are your words. We, the trans, just happen to be the stinging reminders of that war. And that collateral prejudice was our lot. It was the price we paid to be alive. My parents were gracious and long-suffering in their journey, believing that people weren't racists. They just hadn't taken the time to know us yet. And that is, it stands in such stark contrast to you, which you said, I was tired of the narrow path permitted to me because of how I looked, tired of the instant and lazy stereotypes that people applied to me. Did my friends suffer this same way? Your parents' experience of racism and your racism, the experience of racism that you've had through your life, is it a daily consideration for you in Portland? Is it something that you think about or experience in that state to the north?
I mean, I don't, that's a, I mean, Maine is the second whitest state in the country, but, Portland is relatively diverse. It's got, I think it's got like 30% people of color, maybe. I could be wrong about that. Don't quote me on that. Maybe it's 25%. Anyway, I think the racism that I experience here is, kind of different, but also kind of the same. It's the racism that, sort of is still here in America. And I think it's tricky, I think now, because I'm a parent, so I'm trying to sort of navigate that with my kids too, right? And trying to sort of talk to them about it in a way that they can understand, and sort of recognize injustice. I think for me personally, it's like, it's a journey of, how do I live sort of my fullest and best life and be the best person I can be, right? And not be sort of, be defeated by or feel sort of stymied, right, by, racism, and still also sort of be anti-racist, right? It's not enough to just be not racist, right? Like, how do I, if I don't participate in the system, it still is sort of working, right? The gears are still turning, right? So my question for myself is, sort of how do I, living anywhere, right, whether it would be in Maine or New York City, right, what are the active things that I'm doing to be anti-racist? And I think that it's something that, I ask of myself, and, eventually I'm going to ask of my kids, and it's the same question that I would ask about, the patriarchy too, right? Like, what are the things that I'm doing to sort of dismantle that system that, pays women less money for the same job that men do, right? And, all those things.
A question we got from the audience is tied to this. What do you think is the most important thing schools can do to support immigrant and refugee students right now? I don't know if you are running across many immigrants in Portland. I mean, I know up in Lewiston, of course, there's a huge Somalian community there. Sure. But someone was curious as to what you thought schools should do or can do, or what are the most important things to do, rather?
I think, gosh, I mean, I think that's such a big question. Usually I just default to, I'm just a tattooer. I'll answer this question though. I think it is so critical that kids have teachers who look like them. I think I've seen studies, I know the New York Times reported about this, that if Black or brown kids have one teacher of color, they are something like 30% or 40% more likely to graduate. That is, that effect, whether it's cause and effect or, corollary or whatever, that's astounding to me, that like having just one teacher who looks like you in the trajectory of your, K through 12 experience could, that profoundly affect, the outcomes of your graduation. I think that's just so critical, right? So never mind sort of curricular things, top-down things, and just hire more. I mean, let me just say this: I've never ever had a Black teacher, ever. And actually, I've never had an Asian teacher either. So I mean, and I'm not. That's not an indictment of the educational system. I benefited incredibly from public education, but who knows what would have happened if I'd actually had a teacher who just wasn't a white person. It certainly couldn't have made things worse, right? Yeah. And all that said, I am so deeply indebted to my teachers who cared about me. But I think that statistic is really, that little bit of research has really sort of stuck with me for a long time. So I think like even my work in the classroom, I just think even if, I had a bad day teaching, at least like I'm presenting to both white kids and non-white kids, like, hey, like here's this guy and he doesn't look like us, and he's a scholar and loves ancient languages, and isn't that cool, right? So yeah.
It's so important. It's so very important. Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, but I'm still just a tattooer. I don't.
We have another question about writing. What advice you would have for somebody who's second generation and who's having a hard time teasing out the stories, the family stories? How do you get the family members to talk?
Wow. Gosh, I guess yeah. I suppose it depends on the relationship that the person has with the family. I think, I was really careful in thinking about what stories I had a right to tell and what stories I didn't have a right to tell. So I think with one or two exceptions, in the entire book, I'm present as an actor in the story. I think it's tricky when we start trying to tell other people's stories, and we may or may not have permission to do that. So I think, I think like everything else, right, it's relational. So I think whoever this person is, if they're in relationship with their parents or their, extended family, and they have permission to tell that story, I think that's one thing. But I certainly wouldn't advise writing a tell-all memoir when you don't have everybody on board to tell that story, unless it's your own story, right? If it's your own story, then have at it. But
that goes back to the authenticity that you were talking about earlier when we were talking about memoir writing and what's on the paper aligning with what's true for you.
For sure, yeah. And memoir, right, is different from autobiography, right? Like memoir is just sort of like my recollection of things. So whereas autobiography, I think, is a little more rigid in some ways, maybe. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
So the American dream that you were living in Carlisle was was rural, suburban, and then you had a real love of New York as an idea, or Philadelphia, a sort of love of urban as an ideal, and that sort of rural urban thing that you experienced as a child. What was going on there?
Yeah, I just felt like, I wonder if, I don't know if that's a natural kind of like a universal truth, right? That kids from small towns want to leave it, and maybe not. I don't, it's hard to say. But I think, when we would visit my cousins who lived in Staten Island, New York, and anytime we went there, I just thought, this place is amazing. There's like people from everywhere. You can get literally anything, if you're willing to go to the store that sells it. It just felt like the opposite of, the small town that I grew up in the sense of possibilities, and I think when you're young, you just think, well, I'm limited because of where I live. And if I just move to the place that, has, lots of, openings and opportunities for me to take advantage of, then I'm going to live my fullest and best self. I mean, now, right, we realize that, it's sort of like a confluence of a bunch of things, that it's not just the physical geography of things. I mean, the geography certainly helps. I mean, like both things can be true. But when I was young, like you're kind of just goofy, and I'm, 15, and I just think like, ugh, Carlisle, it's the worst, but New York City, it's the best, and, it's, now having lived in New York City, it's like, New York's got its problems too.
And have you been to Saigon?
I have not. Yeah. So I've wanted to go back, and I will go back at some point. For a long time I was waiting to go back with my parents, actually, just because I thought if I'm going to go back, I want to go back with them and experience it with them. But my parents are actually pretty adamant about never going back. I think in their minds it's occupied enemy territory. It's still occupied by, the North Vietnamese government, or, now just Vietnam. But I think they have such sort of deep resentment about it that I don't think they could ever go back. That said, my aunts and uncles, so my father's siblings have gone back, and they like vacation there, and my brother went there on his honeymoon. So it's my family is not even unified in their relationship with current Vietnam. It's just different for everyone. Yeah.
Maybe for your list down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's definitely very high on my list of places to go next. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have time for just one more question. And Phuc, you worked in the library in high school.
I sure did.
Can you tell us about that and how that impacted you and your reading and whatever else you have? We'll end this on a library note.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh my gosh. I was so excited to land the library page job. It was like a dream come true. Well, so prior to that, I was working in the mall at this like dead mall making smoothies, which was not great. And then I got the job working as a library page, and it was just amazing. I probably was not the best library page, but I certainly loved working there. And I loved, just being exposed to books, and, like on my break, I would just browse around and like pick up books and read random things. Like I memorized the Dewey Decimal System. It wasn't Library of Congress, it was Dewey Decimal. So like that was really amazing and fun. And I got first dibs on all the discard sales, which, I was so excited about. So yeah, it was just amazing. And my father just was so incredibly grateful to the library. Like he, one of the very first things that we did when we came to the US, my father went straight to the public library and got a library card, and he kept it for the entire time that we lived in Carlisle, like the exact same one. It was like falling apart, and it had like a little, you remember how you had a paper, like a cardboard card, and you had a little metal bit in there with the numbers on there, and you'd run it across the stamp or the whatever, the library card thingy. Yeah, so my dad kept the exact same library card for like 20 years. But it was basically like second church for my father, and I certainly loved it as well. Yeah, go libraries.
So with that, we do want to turn this over to you for a closing out inspirational reading, if you have one for us.
Sure, I do. Yeah.
Thank you.
April 1979. Why don't you go play on that playground? My parents were strolling with me and my brother when they spotted the playground and allowed us to run over to the swings. The playground was modest, just a small 5-foot slide, some gymnastic rings, 2 swings, and a seesaw. My brother, 3 years old, clambered up the slide ladder as I hopped onto a swing and pumped my way into Star Wars orbit. My parents stood by the fence and Vietnamesed quietly with each other while Lou and I played. A little blonde boy approached us. Why are you in my yard? He hopped onto the other swing. I swung past him. What do you mean? We're just playing. He and I were on opposite arcs, his up to my down, his down, my down to his up. This is my yard. I mean, it's okay to swing, but it's my yard. I looked at the playground, noticing for the first time how close it was to the apartment building and how small it was. It wasn't a playground. It was his yard and his swing set. I jumped off the swing. Oh, I'm sorry. I started to run off. Come on, Lou, this isn't a playground. Trying to leave before my embarrassment could turn into humiliation. The sliding glass door of the adjoining apartment opened, and a woman in a bleach blonde bob, baby blue tennis polo, white shorts, flip-flops, pink nail polish, and smooth muscular legs appeared. A neighbor, right out of Three's Company, a shimmering vision of network primetime. But we hadn't come and knocked on her door, and she wasn't waiting for us. I stopped and she walked by me, patting me gently on the back of my head. Oh, sweetie, you can keep playing. Go ahead, it's all right. I vacillated, weighing what course of action would be more embarrassing, my hesitation was broken by the boy's question, hey, do you like Star Wars? And with that question, my embarrassment was quickly displaced by Star Wars, my otherness replaced by galactic familiarity. Yeah, I love Star Wars. Want to play X-Wings? I slid back on the swing next to his and off we soared. His name was Tim. I told him my name a few times as he whipped past me. Phuc, rhymes with Luke. He nodded affirmatively. Tim was a little younger than me. He liked Star Wars, I liked Star Wars, and that was enough for a best friendship. His mother walked over to my parents and smiled widely, extending her hand. My parents shook her hand and bowed simultaneously, and their heads bobbed up and down as my father did most of the Englishing. Her eyes crinkled and she angled her head to one side, the universal posture for I'm listening as hard as I can. I could see my father's head tilting and tipping as he gestured in the direction of our apartment. I heard her say, "Come over any time." She treated us as though we were like everyone else, with a smile and with kindness, the kindness that kept my parents' faith flickering.
Phuc, that was truly inspirational and making me feel better about heading off into this night. I love that. It definitely a coda to the American experience and beyond racism, as they say. So thank you so much for being here. And we look forward to catching up with you with your next book, which we didn't ask about, but good luck to you and thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Margaret. And thank you, Boston Public Library and American Genealogical and WGBH. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. We'll be doing more of these authors events for your enjoyment out there, for ours, and for the sake of keeping arts and culture alive in this challenging time. Where I work at the oldest genealogical organization in the country, we help people of all backgrounds research their family. We love their stories. We love history. On May 14th, with the Boston Public Library, we'll welcome one of our city's best loved historians, Stephen Puleo, with Voyage of Mercy, his true tale of Irish-American relations during the potato famine. On May 20, journalist Libby Copeland will join us for more nonfiction, her remarkable investigative look at the impact of DNA testing in her new book, The Lost Family. We hope you'll join us again. Phuc, I'm delighted you were with us tonight, sharing your Americanist story. Kristin, it's a pleasure working with you. And to all of you out there, have a wonderful, inspirational evening.